Pass me the mic and I'ma wreck it, my kid, and he gonna wreck it.
Welcome to Chatting with Casey with your host, Casey Palmer.
Episode 16 of Flower, Fables, and Fleeing to the North. Welcome to Chatting with Casey, the podcast that's all about family, food, fashion, and faith, and travel, and tech, and rediscovering the reason why we share our stories online, even when we've lost our way nearly a decade down the road. Do anything long enough and you'll find yourself in a far different place than you were when you started, not always entirely sure of how you wound up where you are today. 11 and a half years and 17 role changes later, I have a very different view of working for the Ontario Public Service than I did in July 2007. If I go back and look at the dreams and worries I had on the day my 5-year-old was born, you'll also find that they're quite different from how I see things as a parent today. Truth is, after all this time spent writing, I felt lost. I'd made it all the way from writing journals in the 90s to building a digital presence, but now what? I'd made some money and now I had a name for myself, but this couldn't be all that there was. I had too many ideas that hadn't seen the light of day and knew there was a ton of potential still unrealized inside. What I was doing wasn't working. I could just keep banging my head against the wall, but I didn't think that would get me anywhere either. It took a long time until I found my answer for what I needed to do. But one stop I'd make on this journey of self-realization was 2018's Dad 2.0 conference in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I do a ton of things and meet a bunch of people, one of whom was Christine Tremblay, story strategist and today's guest on Chatting with Casey. Fellow Canadian dad bloggers Buzz Bishop and Chris Reed had been trying to get me to go to the Dad 2.0 conference for years, both of them having a number of them under their belts. And so, in early 2018, off the heels of a very successful year prior, I finally put my money where my mouth is and made the damn thing happen. I already covered a number of my feelings about the conference in a blog post I wrote shortly after, link in the show notes, but I remember it being way more of a conference about dads and less about dad bloggers. Here were a bunch of guys who weren't so much about improving their reach or landing a sponsor and more about building meaningful relationships with other men who might even have a chance of understanding what they were going through in their lives. I already knew a few people going in, Chris Reed and Mike Reynolds, fellow Canadians who I'd shared the space with for years by then, and a few other people I got to know in the Dad 2.0 Facebook group before flying down for the event. But when I got there, it was clear that a lot of people had a lot of catching up to do, and though it was great to make new friends, at times I just felt so alone. Which is why it meant a lot to me when Mike and Christine Tremblay decided to take me out and show me the New Orleans that most tourists don't normally get to see. And we talked. Oh, how we talked. And what I didn't realize back then was that all that talking and all the work I'd put into things, it's that kind of stuff that'd get me to finally start the podcast. Finally start doing new things that'd make my slump a thing of the past. I caught up with Christine while she was in her California leg of a road trip to talk stories, the evil that flour does, and why she really wants to be Canadian. It's all happening on Chatting with Casey. Let's check it out. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Chatting with Casey. And I'm here with my guest, Christine Tremblay. Christine, how are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. I appreciate it. If you aren't part of my Facebook, which I would assume most people aren't because 2,000 people does not make 7 billion. I did put out a request for people to join me on my little podcast when I had a guest drop out for the evening, and then wound up with 20 friends who were all okay to be podcasted. So it's been a busy day getting through all that, and that's how Christine came to join us tonight. Christine and I first met at the Dad 2.0 or Dad 2018. It gets like stylized as Dad 2.018, but no one calls it Dad 2.018 when they're actually having a in person or vocal conversation. So Dad 2.0 2018. And it was in my eyes, you may see the story a little differently, Christine, but in my eyes, after bringing her ketchup chips from Canada because they don't have that in the States, which should be like it's a horrible crime you guys don't have ketchup chips.
It is such a crime. And you were my rock star hero because you didn't just show up with like, hey, here's a bag of ketchup Lay's. You brought me ketchup chips. Like
I tried.
multiple bags. It was incredible. And for those of you listening, I mean, I don't know how many of you are in Canada and how many of you aren't. And I know ketchup chips seem to sound really strange to a lot of Americans. They're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. These are a regular thing in Canada. And like, just imagine barbecue chips, which you don't think are that weird, but they're with ketchup instead of barbecue.
Yeah.
They're incredible.
I never understood with so many flavors of everything in the US how you don't have ketchup chips. I mean, I'm sure there's reasons. I haven't looked into it deeply, understand the legality or why.
I can't figure it out. And lately I've started seeing the all dressed chips in the US, which is really interesting because all dressed was also a Canadian only flavor.
Yeah, for a long time. I'm surprised to hear that actually.
And because until just a year or so ago, I had never seen them in the United States. And the first place I saw them in the United States was just outside of New Orleans in Louisiana. But anyways, we are diverging from your story. So you brought me ketchup Lay's.
That's generally how my podcast works. Don't even worry. This is a very regular thing where it's like, oh, Casey went on a tangent again. But it was actually really poignant for me when we met because I'd been prodded to go to Dad 2.0 by my fellow Canadians, Chris Reed, Buzz Bishop, for a number of years. Maybe I want to say 2 years. And they talked about, the warm and fuzzy feelings and everything they felt when going. But I felt that a little bit on day one, but also felt like a bit of an outsider because, people had known each other for ages and you had these groups of people catching up and they hadn't seen each other in maybe a year. And I kind of just felt outside of the group a bit, and you and Mike were really cool and decided, we should go have dinner together and took us to the spot over in, I want to say the French Quarter, but I don't know New Orleans geography whatsoever.
Mike, for those of you listening, being my husband, Mike Tremolay, and the Tremolay family is from New Orleans, like something like 7 generations back into New Orleans history. And oh my God, now I'm actually blanking. Oh, we actually went just outside of the French Quarter to a street called Frenchman Street.
Yes.
So that's where there's a lot of really cool clubs on Frenchman Street. And it's sort of like more like no New Orleans local is going to Bourbon Street.
Right.
Pretty much ever. Because it's so touristy, but they will go to Frenchman Street. And so we went to the Port of Call restaurant, one of my personal favorites. And then we went, did we go into the jazz club across the street as well?
I think we were going to stop by, but we had to bypass
maybe it was
it was too busy.
Like certain nights it's free, but other nights it has a cover. I think maybe it had a cover, but then we also went to the delectable Café du Monde.
Oh, indeed. Indeed.
And so that you could experience beignets. But I've also been that person that's shown up at the conference, right? And I don't know everyone else. And by like day 2, it's warmed up and it's okay. But that first day, it's always so hard. And of course, we immediately thought you were just incredible. First of all, because you're Canadian, and I secretly want to be Canadian. This would be why I know things like ketchup lays and what all dressed is and all of these other things are. So one of my best friends actually lives in Calgary, so I'm very familiar with Canada. I've visited Canada many times, and but it was also a bit of that, like, the New Orleans Southern culture in us, that we were just like, what? You don't have dinner plans? Well, guess what? Now you do. And before you knew it, you had dinner plans.
It was amazing. I
So
had a really good time. Protocol was delicious, and I remember just having some great one-on-two time, I guess, because it was three of us. But getting away from just the onslaught of everything happening at the conference was good change of pace to just sit down, soak some of it in, and just get to know each other a bit better, which I really appreciated.
And then later that weekend, we went to Mike and I. We did a vehicle test drive, and we went to Bouchon, but like the butcher side of it. It's like this really cool restaurant in, I don't know if that's technically Central Business District or what part of the city it's in, but Mike and I went over there, and we brought you back a praline so that you could have a taste of New Orleans.
Indeed.
Or praline, depending on who you're talking to. It's sort of the same thing, but like a pecan confection. So,
well, I'm pretty sure that, it would be grating to most people from New Orleans when they come up to Toronto. It's like, oh, Casey, how's your trip to New Orleans?
Yeah. New Orleans, or as we tend to call it, New Orleans, it definitely has its very own language and street names that are spelled really crazy and everything else. And Mike and I live in Houston, so it's, I think it's about 5 to 6 hours, depending on how fast you drive. If you make the mistake of leaving so that you get stuck in Baton Rouge, and whether or not you make too many pit stops on the way. But it's not that in Texas terms, it's not that far away. So we visit there sometimes a couple times a year, other times just once. But it was fun getting to show it to somebody that hadn't been there before. So that was a lot of fun for us. I'm glad that we got to spend that evening with you.
I actually have some family in Houston. So I have to visit eventually. My parents have visited. I don't think either of my brothers have visited, but they're telling me a lot about just how good the barbecue is down there and everything. And I think this family lives about like an hour outside of Houston. But yeah, they were just going on and on about everything from flavors to portion sizes. We actually have a couple one pit master up here. I want to say Houston, but I almost think he could be from Dallas, which I know is very different. I know Texas has some cultures depending on the city.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get it wrong. But yeah. I mean,
I will say portion sizes in Texas, it's kind of out of control. Like Texas is Houston especially. We are really finally, like, we are solidly on the map now for our food. GQ magazine did a write-up not long ago about food, and our food culture is just, it's incredible. It's a very amazing thing to watch. I especially love watching how much the chefs in the city support each other. I like that sense of community. It's not I don't get a sense as a customer watching them on social media. I don't get a sense that they're like backstabbing and, hating on each other. It's definitely a sense of community, but our cost of living is lower in Houston than a lot of other cities. We've got a really good cost of living, and dining out is like, people are always surprised when they come to Houston at how affordable it is to dine out, and the fact that sometimes they give you a plate full of food that could feed a family of 4. So
Yeah. I had that experience a bit in Chicago where I would order something for like, 9, 10.99. That's I expect to be a single meal, and then I get through like a quarter of it maybe if I'm lucky, and I was always like, I don't understand how people eat all this. I'm very confused by these portion sizes.
Right. I've learned to actually try to split meals with people. Or, yeah, it just makes a lot more sense. The portion sizes are out of this world.
I do people can actually sit down like okay here I guess this is a good way to try and translate it for Canadians so that we can understand this. How long do meals last in like Texas or Chicago or the States?
Oh, that part I don't know. Just because I live with one of the fastest eaters on the planet.
Oh wow.
And I'm one of the slowest eaters. So meals are an interesting thing for the two of us. He's always done long before I am. But just imagine getting a meal that's like a larger than you expected portion of protein with then like a very starchy side. It's probably going to be a potato something, and sometimes even a vegetable as well. But like if they put a plate in front of you at most places, obviously if you're dining at like a finer dining establishment, the portions aren't like this. But if you go get barbecue, man, they're going to fill up your plate. Like you're going to have like, oh my goodness, the baked potatoes are about as big as your head. It's insane.
How's it a potato anymore? How do you get a potato that big? Where do you find these potatoes from?
I have no idea where they get them from. But not even that long ago, I went to a barbecue place and they gave me a dinner plate that was, oh God, like it was probably in just this giant baked potato on it. It was huge. And like that baked potato could have fed 3 people. And I had the baked potato with meat on top. And so there was enough meat on top that would have filled a sandwich and a half. Yeah. So
oh my goodness.
You have to learn to restrain your portion sizes on your own. And it's been really interesting because at the moment that we're recording this, I've been on a 2-month-long road trip and I'm currently sitting in California right now. And so portion sizes here are just like normal portion sizes, much more in line.
They're minute compared to Texas.
Yeah, much more in line with like what we should be eating. So it'll be interesting when I get home soon and get back to these crazy portion sizes.
But on the entire idea of portion sizes and food and whatnot, you've been on a rather extraordinary weight loss journey recently, haven't you?
Oh, I have been. Speaking of portion sizes, and this is why I said it's kind of interesting. I locked down and just sort of went hardcore with doing keto. So, and I don't, I need to go back and read things on keto again, because at this point it's like I eat, if it's meat or cheese or vegetables, I eat it. And, but I also, starting in March, I also cut back on my portion sizes some. And that's not normally something that you do in keto. It's normally more about like what ratio of meat to, what ratio of protein to fats and carbs did you have? And I've reached a point now where I'm really just like, I just want a little bit of meat and some cheese and a little bit of veggie and I'm good. Kind of like our grandparents probably ate in North America.
Okay.
Back in the 40s. Actually, I own them. It's so funny. I started to say my mother has these plates, but she's actually passed them on to me. I have my great grandmother's luncheon plates. And these were like a set of dishes that she would have used, not for the regular evening meal, but just like if some ladies came over to her house for a little luncheon. And it's amazing to look at these plates and see how much smaller they are than what most of us use. But that's...
Oh, you mean as to just kind of like the portions and how things have evolved over time with how much we eat because we're trying to fit onto larger plates and things of that nature.
Right. Right. And
Ah,
there is some truth to the whole, like the Super Size Me movie. I remember as a child, like it was a big deal if you got a quarter pounder or a Big Mac when you went to McDonald's.
mhm.
Normally you just got a cheeseburger. And now we're up to like, I don't know what, like quadruple quarter pounders. I don't know. It's,
We don't have those up
yeah.
here.
But that's, we do. And
Wow.
so, but also in the journey to doing keto and cutting carbs out of my diet, I discovered I'm actually allergic to flour.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of my health problems cleared up on their own as soon as I stopped eating flour, because flour was making me congested and therefore inflamed. It was making my joints hurt and all these other things. As soon as I cut it out of my diet, I felt so much better. And a lot of times when yeah.
That's sorry. Go
Well, I was
ahead.
to
Go
say, I
ahead.
know like one of the things you love talking about is what we're passionate about. And I'm that crazy person that when I talk to people and they say how like I have so many allergies, I'm just like, oh my goodness, have you ever tried cutting flour out of your diet? You might be allergic to flour. And people are really resistant to it. I was a
Mhm.
hardcore, what I call pastatarian. I ate pasta like for probably 4 or 5 meals a week, if not more. I ate pasta all the time. So I was always eating flour. And so I was just like a constant hum of being congested and slightly sick. But I had no idea
Right.
until I cut it out of my diet. And within a week, actually, I could see major improvements in my health
A week.
within a week. At the
Wow.
10-day mark, I went to my massage therapist. I swam competitively in high school. Okay, that sounds way more fancy than it is. I was on the swim team in high school, and I swam.
Okay.
Butterfly was my competitive stroke. And so my shoulders to this day are a bit messed up thanks to years of swimming butterfly. So I see a massage therapist pretty regularly. And 10 days after I cut flour out of my diet, she said, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. Because she could actually feel the difference in the inflammation in my muscles.
Wow.
So the fact that it wasn't just me saying I felt different, but that she could feel it, you know, 'cause she was used to working on me. The fact that she could actually
Right.
feel a difference blew me away. So
That's amazing.
that is one of my big passions. And I mentioned being out here in California. Traveling is the other one.
That's good because we have a lot of people who, well, Toronto, is a city that loves to travel more so than most places, largely because we have a airport that goes to so much of the world. It truly is international. So I don't know if it's the same for all of Canada, but I know at least in Toronto, we almost revere our passports over any other piece of identification we have. Driver license are nice, but we're one of the worst cities to drive in. Your health card's great because you're going to need it, but you're not, sick 24/7. But passports for us are like gold. That is just your thing. People compare how many stamps they have with each other and things like that on routinely. So, yeah, travel's big
I
over here.
love travel. And I've taken to a really interesting thing has happened to me over the past few years. It's just the fact that I found that I really enjoy doing road trips so I can actually see the country instead of just flying over it from one destination to another. It's hard living in Houston because literally you cannot get out of the state of Texas. I can't. The fastest way out of Texas is driving to Louisiana, and that's still 2+ hours to the border. And going up through Dallas, or on this trip, I actually went out the west side of Texas. Like I drove straight across for, I don't know, 700 something miles across Texas. And it was a long drive, but I now appreciate just all the differences in the state a lot more, which becomes really helpful with what my big, like my life passion is. It's interesting how it all ties together.
Okay.
So, going all the way back, also random trivia for those of you listening, my geek claim to fame is that I named WordPress.
Yes, we talked about this for a bit, that you were the one who we can all, I was going to say blame, but blame's not the right word, attribute this to.
Credit. I did name WordPress back in 2003. Matt Mullenweg, one of the founders of WordPress, is from Houston. I started blogging, though, all the way back in 2000. So my ultimate passion is tied into our stories. Matter of fact, I just recently spoke at a word camp, which is a event for people in an area. You could travel to it too, but it's an event for people who are either using WordPress, fans of WordPress, developers in WordPress. It's just a WordPress related event. And I spoke at it on like why WordPress matters in the first place. And that's because the power of our stories. Like all of us have stories that are really powerful. And in the process of naming WordPress, and why I brought it up is because when Matt was developing this, and I'm several years older than Matt, so he was still in high school or had just started his freshman year in college, right about in that time frame. And he kept telling me that the software that he was developing was going to change the world. And being older and more jaded, I was like, oh, that's adorable that you think this is going to change the world. Joke's on me. He was right. 32%. I was told at this word camp that 32% of the internet is now powered by WordPress.
Impressive.
But the bigger thing was, so when I named WordPress, and this is the reason why, for any of you that are WordPress users, if you've ever wondered why you have to go to wordpress.org to download it. When I named it, I called them and I said, WordPress.com is taken, but it's okay. There's nothing there. WordPress.org is available though. And he said, I always want it to be free. And even part of how, when we talked about inspiration for the name, one of the things we talked about was the printing press and that was when he even said, I believe this is going to change the world, just like the printing press changed the world. It helped.
I guess that explains Gutenberg.
Right. And that's why it's now named, why this thing inside of WordPress is named Gutenberg, because we very specifically talked about the Gutenberg printing press. Just making it easier. The printing press made it so that people could print books and that books could be more distributed and books were no longer limited to the wealthy. And WordPress made it so that everyone could publish online. We all could share our stories. We all have something to say to the world. And how this ties into my end passion, I help entrepreneurs use the internet and plus their story, because I'm a story strategist, and I help them figure out how to use this so that they can sell, so that they can make more money, so and bring more money into their business. But one of the biggest things I do with people is like, what's your story? What's the thing we want to put out there? What's the thing that we want to say? And so many of us get so wrapped up in our heads of whatever, my story's no big deal. But that's not the case. Story is what brings us together. Story is how we as humans have communicated with one another since the beginning of time. Like cave drawings are stories. Like story truly matters to us. And it's what ignites our brain. It's what helps us remember things. For those of you listening to this podcast right now, I always, when I talk about this, I always point out, I'm like, think back to yesterday. What did you do at the end of your day? Your work was done. What did you do? You may have read a book. You watched a TV show. You talked with a loved one in person, or you made a phone call. You got on Facebook. You read a blog. You listened to a podcast. All of those are stories. And it's just so integrated into our life. And but I feel like we're also taught as a society not to celebrate our stories.
Really?
I feel like you and I as bloggers, like we're at an advantage because since we started blogging, we made a choice to put ourselves out there. And we made a choice to share our stories. But a lot of business owners start their business around something that they're passionate about. I work with a lot of creatives, but especially a lot of photographers, because that's what I did for 10 years. I was a professional photographer. And a lot of people I work with say this. They're like, I'm nobody special. Nobody wants to hear about what I have to say. I don't have anything to say. I don't want to talk about my kids. Like, they don't know what they want to put out in the world. So I think I'd even be interested, since you have also been blogging for a bit, in hearing like what drove you to do it. And did you ever feel a resistance in it? Or do you still feel a resistance in it?
That's a good question, actually. I like when podcasts get turned on me sometimes.
Sorry. I podcast as well. And it's a combination of the coach in me and the podcast in me, the podcaster.
No problem. I have a good answer for that. I can make this work. So let's start with the podcast itself. The reason why I started this was partly because I have a person who I interacted with on Twitter, and she passed away a few years back, but I used to regularly show up on another friend's show, and she always thoroughly enjoyed those episodes where we'd banter back and forth and said that I should really start up my own podcast and make that happen. So something I just kind of, I won't say I waffled on it for 5 years. It was one of those things where life happened. Had kids. I was busy doing other things. So I really never got around to sitting down and making it happen. But now that I've started podcasting, I don't see myself stopping anytime soon. It's super enjoyable. I love having conversations with people. And it really works as another extension of the blog, because the blog has always been a place where I've told stories, got to hone my skills, and further understand the power of stories and how it all comes together. And with the blog, I've been blogging in some shape or form since about 2002. And it only turned into its more mature form on the current site around 2010, 2011. And so now it's at a point where I've really gotten used to this being part of my life. And I think it's woven itself into all these different areas. I have my Facebook conversations, and where I've started massive debates on things without perhaps intending to do so. It's part of how I write at work. It's part of how I do everything is from a story first perspective. And yeah, it doesn't always, it doesn't always work with people. I know that even my parents took a long time to get to the point where they accepted that this is just who I am and how I communicate. I found it interesting when I put out the call for people to come on the podcast that my brother's girlfriend offered him up to be on the podcast. And I very much want to make that one happen because we have, decades of history that we can unpack for the world to see, which I don't think he'll appreciate, but I think I'm going to go with it anyway.
Well,
And yeah, in general, it's stories. There's power of stories has been a big part of just why I do what I do. I think everyone, like you said, everyone does have a story and they don't always realize it. And I think I really look forward to providing them a platform in order to get that one or two stories out that they want to share and just never had a place
well,
to do
and
it.
I think sometimes those little things that we think are so mundane and trivial. We started this podcast talking about ketchup lays. How many people would have started that way? Probably not that many, but it's a trivial little tidbit that I think I threw out there. I think I was like, what? You're coming from Canada? I need some ketchup lays. Can you hook me up? And I was actually like kind of stunned when you were like, here you go. Here's your ketchup lays. I was like, oh my God, you came through for me. You were totally my hero in that moment. Because it was like, it was a blip of a comment in this conversation. But so many things, like I would say, like if you think about your memories, stories are even attached to them. You don't just have a memory of, Christine said she likes ketchup lays, but you're like, some future listener might show up and hand me ketchup lays and be like, hey, I heard on that podcast, blah, blah, blah. Like it's going to be wrapped into a story. The interesting thing about story that I've learned and the different research I've done on story and how we show up in them and stuff is I believe it was when I was watching David Eagleman did a PBS series. I don't know if it's available in Canada, but it's called The Brain. And it's it was like a 4 or 6 part series on the brain, obviously. And one of the things he talks about, the whole, in the end, almost all of it was tied into story and this whole situation around stories and how our brain uses stories to unpack what's going on, like what it doesn't understand. That's why we dream. But he also pointed out that when you hear or read a story, especially in the case of a personal story, it can cause a release of oxytocin, which is the love drug. Like oxytocin is what makes you fall in love with somebody. So for those of us that are solo entrepreneurs or maybe a small business owner or bloggers, whatever it is that you do, every time you put a story out there and you connect with people on this personal level, you are, in fact, causing them to fall in love with you a little bit, even if it's just for a few minutes.
I mean, as long as it's for a few minutes, because I don't think Sarah wants to hear that.
I don't mean like fall in love, but I mean like that same, it has a very similar influence on our brain. In the case of a blogger, if you want more traffic, you want them to keep coming back. You want them to have that sense of caring about you because that's what's going to make a reader come back and read your blog more. If you're a business owner, you want them to have that feeling about you. I started a photography business in 2007. I don't know if you know this, but digital cameras are pretty accessible now. And a lot of people consider themselves a photographer. And that,
Indeed.
I am not judging that. I don't feel that that's a bad thing. I actually think it's fantastic. I love that it's opened up the door for so many people to be business owners. But I was talking a year ago or so with a friend of mine that is a professional photographer in Houston. And we were talking about back in 2007. And he's like, you just exploded onto the scene. He's like, you didn't exist. And then all of a sudden you were everywhere. And the reason for that, I pointed out to him, I said, the reason for that was I'd already been blogging for 7 years at that point in time. So I was really comfortable with sharing my story and using that to connect with people through my blog and social media. And as a result, I made 6 figures my first year in business in a very crowded market.
Wow.
Even right now, if I was sitting at my house in Houston at this minute, I live within walking distance of 5 other very good professional photographers. So it's a crowded market. And I brought in 6 figures, and 100% the secret to my success was just authentically sharing myself and then connecting with people over it. And I think that it's very easy for us, though, to dismiss that power that we have of doing that.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and I'm going to insert my experience in here a little as well, in that that's a lot of the reason why I've succeeded as a dad creator in general. When we had our first kid in late 2013, I'd already been writing on this site for 3-4 years. I'd already been writing in general for 12-13, and that was even just in the digital space before I was writing my own newspaper articles and other things like that in the analog times. But I've been so used to sharing snippets of life or learning how to take those daily interactions and compress it into a tweet, compress it into a small, like, bite-sized piece of information for people to listen to, that when I had my first son, it was already just business as usual in certain ways. And I just talked about these new experiences and how I take all that and put it into these new bite-sized pieces. And the puzzle pieces of my life had changed, but the way I deliver that information to other people didn't. And because of that, I've become far stronger a storyteller as I take all these new elements and weave it into what I'm telling people every day. But I think that stood out just because of that learned practice, that developed muscle when it comes down to storytelling and how that's all
And
communicated
you
now.
were probably
So,
comfortable with
yeah,
it.
I've seen that.
You were confident in sharing this change in your family. Although, interesting thing,
so, yeah.
I'd be curious your take on this, because this is often pushed back, especially from entrepreneurs. My spouse doesn't want me to share things, or my partner. So for those of you listening, Mike and I met, I'm not going to go in, it's way too long of a story, but Mike and I met, we didn't meet online per se, but we did meet because of our blogs. And he hosted a meetup for Houston bloggers, is where we ended up meeting in person for the first time. We knew of one another prior to that online, but had never interacted, had never talked. And he already knows this, so if he's listening, I don't feel bad. I pulled up his blog, and it was like talking about code and everything else, and I was bored to tears. A mutual friend of ours that lives in London was like, "You two have to meet." And I was like, why does she think I need to meet this guy? Yeah, literally. He was talking, because he was a bored bachelor in London. He was coding a website where if you and a friend wanted to meet up at a pub, you could put in like what tube stop you were going to meet at, and it would tell you the pubs in the area. And I think he had been like writing blog posts about that. And I was like, what? Like that make an amazing like iPhone app now. But at the time I did not appreciate this app or the functionality of it.
Right.
It may have even involved like I'm coming from tube stop A and you're coming from tube stop B, and we should meet at this third tube stop in the middle. So we met because of it. So in that case, I was always comfortable writing about us and our relationship because he was comfortable with it. But like, did your wife have pushback to you sharing so much stuff online?
I think this entire world has been something she's gotten used to over time. Here's the story I love to tell that she hates me telling, but I love telling because she hates me telling it, perhaps. So she's from a communications background. She went to postgraduate study for PR over at Humber College up here. And she always had this very corporate and professional approach to how you do PR and how you communicate. And I remember we went to a event they had up here, third Tuesdays. It was 2008. I think we've been dating maybe 6-7 months by this point. And we went to an event in 2008, and at the front of it was a Twitter wall, and it just blew my mind. I'm like, wait. So there's a wall at the front where our tweets will all show up, and I can interact with people at the event, and it will be live. This is happening. So I started joking around and sending up random tweets and throwing up all these puns and everything about what was going on at the event. And I remember coming out of the event and she was livid. She was like, that's not how you represent yourself. That is not how you act like a professional in this industry. It's like, you embarrass yourself. You embarrassed me. This is horrible. It's like, I was like, all right, I'm sorry. And I remember that I didn't use Twitter all that much. It wouldn't be until about 2 years later when I went to my first tweet up and really started getting into it. But now, a decade later, it's, that this is a core element of my life. I'm tweeting all the time. I'm putting out Instagram posts. I'm putting out all this stuff about our family all the time. And I think part of it is just she's seen the growth from that moment till now, where she understands the gravity of everything that's happening. And she knows a lot about how I curate. And I won't share everything about our family. I'll choose very key moments or things that won't really embarrass anyone or make a negative impact on our family. So I think it's gone from a stage of like, what the heck is this guy doing, to making sure that we don't have anything that feels too intimate. I think in the beginning, actually, we had a few more rules on where things got shared. It's like, well, I'm going to share this, picture of our baby between these like 25 people. I was like, okay, for now. And then as time has gone on, it's just become so woven into my growing story as a content creator that now it's almost just, you can't separate the two. They're woven into each other. They come with me to events. They show up all over the place. Trying to keep that, for ourselves and try to keep it, behind the curtain is next to impossible. So I think we all just accept that it's going from a stage where it was just me talking about my life to, hey, here's all of us, and we're all part of this family life that we're leading.
So I started blogging, and my son was 7 or 8 years old when I started blogging. I will let you do the math. I started blogging in 2000. He was 7 or 8 years old. Yes, he is now in his 20s. And at that point in time, the parent blogging phenomena had not really taken off yet. And so I didn't write about my son very much. There are very few posts in the archives of my old website that talk about him. And eventually I reached a point in my case, because he was already that old, where I was like, it's his digital legacy. I got the fact that whatever I posted about him was going to be online forever and ever and ever. Yep. I used to have and it's probably still on the sidebar of my personal blog, which I don't blog anymore at my old personal blog, but it's still online as like an archive. Like I mentioned, my husband and my son in the sidebar and stuff. But it was interesting. Just today, I posted something on Facebook where I mentioned my son, which, by the way, I didn't tag him because he doesn't like it when I tag him.
Okay.
So I didn't tag him. I just mentioned my son. And somebody on the post who's known me for probably 7 or 8 years, she was like, I didn't know that you had a son. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I do. I'm like, he's an adult now. And I'm like, but it's his digital legacy, not mine. Which I found ironic that he was then the first person to like the post, but because he doesn't very often. I know he reads my stuff, on Facebook and that, but because we'll message back and forth about things, but he doesn't always like things even that I post. Right. So, and that's always my advice to business owners. Or anyone really, when it comes to all of this content that we're creating, personal brands matter more than ever.
Yep.
Like when I gave that talk at WordCamp, I started talking about brands, and then I realized that part of the audience was blogging just personally. But I pointed out to them, like, your personal brand matters. Forbes and Entrepreneur, several magazines have written fantastic articles about this concept, but like your future employers, the people that you work with, whatever, they're going to look you up on Google the same as you're going to look them up on Google. And your personal brand is going to show up. So what you put out in the world matters, but also what you put out in the world about your children or your spouse matters.
Oh, yeah.
Because if somebody Googled my name because they met Mike, they're going to find my personal stuff. And so it does matter. And so I always say my story ends where somebody else's story begins. So if I'm the main character of the story and I'm telling my story, then it's mine to tell. But it's not for me to tell your story because that's yours. So I think it's really important if you are going to start posting about your family to talk with them about it and to talk with them about what are they comfortable with? Can you use their name? Can you post in one place but not another?
Right.
And if you also use social media or blog for your business, talk with your clients before you just share about them.
That's true.
And it's, 10 years ago, Wild West, we were like, whatever, I'm going to share everything. La, la, la. But yeah, la, 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 whatever. I would have shared like clients' wedding photos and stuff like that without ever thinking about asking them. But now of course, I won't deny, it helped once I had a larger portfolio. So if somebody said no to me, I was not like, oh man, what am I going to post about? Mm-hmm. I don't have another event coming up for 3 weeks and now I've got nothing to share. But now I always go back and ask clients. Even I had a client recently message me something. She sent me a photo. My biggest end goal is helping creative entrepreneurs increase their profits. This is where it sort of comes full circle. I want people to be able to travel or do whatever their passion is in their life. So I want to help people make more money. And so one of my clients sent me a photo holding up a board with the fact that she's made $22,000 since we started working together.
Amazing.
It is amazing. I'm so proud of her. I have goosebumps just thinking about her right now. And so she sent me the photo and I wrote her back and I was like, are you okay? Like, can I share this? And she was like, yeah, that's why I sent you the photo. And I'm like, yes, I've trained you well. But I also wanted to be the example that I would tell her to do. I was like, thank you for sending me that photo. Can I share it?
Of course, yeah.
Can I share your story? And she's like, oh my God, yes. Yes, you can. If anybody wants to talk to you. She actually asked me last night if she could work with me until she's 100. And she's a few years younger than me. So I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I'll still be alive when you're 100, but I hope I am. Let's make this happen. Um, so I'm like, yes, you can work with me until you're 100. I'm all in. But just, thinking through the repercussions of when you post something, it is going to be out there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I finally, my metric for things, like my measure, is this something that I want to share? Oh, I'm going to be in trouble if my mom listens to this podcast, but whatever. My metric for things is, do I want to get a phone call from my mom about it?
Right.
Like, my husband's not, he's not going to say something if I post something online. He's, I don't think he's ever asked me to take down content. But back in 2000, when I first started blogging, I had written a blog post about Christmas and how Christmas was a very stressful time for me back in those days. Just because of some family dynamic things and everything else. And I wrote a blog post about it. And part of it mentioned that I was going to my mom's house for Christmas, etc. So I went back from my mom's house, from her computer. I went to check the comments on the post. And that's how she first found my blog.
Oh, wow.
And she called me. She had seen the history on her computer. And she called me and she was like, this is 2000. Remember, this is not popular or common whatsoever. She called me up and she goes, "What's a blog?" And I was oh, snap. She saw that post. Because that post wasn't I'm sorry, Mom. It wasn't the best. I wasn't in a good place emotionally or mentally. And I was in a really super toxic relationship that I ended actually shortly after I wrote that post. Okay. And the intention of the post was really much more about the toxic relationship, who, by the way, I broke up with that guy on January 1st. On January 1st of 2000, I broke up with him actually on January 3rd of 2001. Mm-hmm. And on January 1st, 2002, I wrote a blog post about him. I didn't name names, but I wrote this whole blog post about how he had kissed me on New Year's Eve. And I realized I never, ever, ever again wanted to kiss him on New Year's Eve. It had been an 8-year-long relationship. And I wrote about it because at that point in time, my blog was my journal. I wrote about everything.
Right.
And so I wrote about that in January of 2002. And he sent me an email and all it said was, "Nice blog post."
Wow.
And I wrote him back and I said, "Thanks. I thought so."
Oh my goodness.
And I don't remember if he sent me yet another email after that. He might have, but I didn't respond to it. I just was yep, I thought it was a nice blog post because I did not deserve to be treated that way. So for me, initially, blogging was a cathartic release to help me through that. But over time, when Mike and I met and we got married, and I was still really blogging about some pretty personal stuff that I have no problem with the world reading. The posts are still online. If you feel like going back and finding my 2005 blog archives, have at it. But my mom called me one day and she's like, "Your mother-in-law reads this." And I was okay, good for her. I love my mom for great on her for actually pointing out to me, thinking through the potential of who might be seeing it. Mm-hmm. I was already aware that my mother-in-law might see it. I'd actually talked to my husband about this one particular post before I wrote it and was like, "Are your parents going to have an issue with this?" Because as a newlywed, I didn't want my mother-in-law to hate me. And he was like, "No, my parents aren't going to care at all." And I was like, "Cool." So, but that became my litmus test. Do I want to get a phone call about this? And if I get a phone call about it, if I hit publish, then I have said to myself, I'm cool with the phone call.
Right.
So,
I mean, that makes sense. I'm going to deviate a bit from this because, yeah, one of the things I find or have found with podcasting in particular, going back to the idea of stories, is not only do I get to tell my story, I get to take a lot of time talking to people about their stories and things I might not be all that much of an expert on.
yeah.
And it's been good because there's been so many areas in which I've been interested to learn more about, or I always wanted to bring certain subject matter and topics to my audience's attention. But it's not like I'll sit down and talk about things, when it comes down to what it might be like to, carry a baby for 9 months or other things that are just so far out of my personal experience. But I just there's certain things where I'm like, we should really talk about that. And it's great to sit down with people and get that out there in some form. So
Well,
sorry, go
and
ahead.
I always love talking with somebody that has a counterpoint or a different view.
Oh, yeah.
Because Facebook, I love you. But my goodness, so often we handle Facebook like you believe one thing and I believe the other. And therefore it's, the world is going to end and catastrophe will happen because we don't believe the same thing. And we don't necessarily effectively communicate or talk about it versus having a conversation like this would resolve so many things. So I always want to know, why do you feel that? I feel this way. Why do you feel that way?
Definitely.
Let's figure this out because most of the time we have common ground and it's just one or two sticking points where we vary. And I just, the world would be a better place if we all learn more about other people, learn more about why people feel a certain way. I mentioned traveling and driving across the United States. Sorry, I've driven to 48 states and 4 Canadian provinces, and I can actually name the provinces and the territories, etc. I'm not kidding when I say I want to be Canadian, but driving to these different places, seeing different regions brings such a different level of understanding to why certain people feel the way that they do. Like visiting Alberta, visiting Calgary, and visiting Toronto help me understand things when I see things in the news related to your government. The eye-opening moment was driving through Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, in the practically in the center of the United States. I think it's 2 people per square mile. It's no population in there's just a few big cities and the rest of it is farmland, ranch land, etc. It's 2 people per square mile. I kind of, while I am not a huge supporter of guns, I kind of understand why if you lived in a country, in a part of the nation with bears and wolves and your nearest neighbor was a mile away, you might want a gun. As much as I don't love guns, I can kind of get it. It makes it easier for me to understand things like cultural differences. It's amazing to me how much our culture is actually influenced by the geography that we live in, and we don't even realize it.
I feel like I have to do a lot more traveling now.
It's an incredible thing. I think everybody needs to do a lot more traveling just to understand the others. And that's the other part of it, right? People aren't others anymore.
Right. They become part of your entire framework of understanding what that first part are, what people are.
They're not so different than me.
Yeah.
I mentioned driving. I drove Interstate 10, I-10, from Houston to California. It actually goes from Florida to California. It goes across the entire country, southern part of the country. And when I drove out of El Paso, Texas, massive border town, and I crossed into New Mexico, and I'm still pretty close to the Mexico border. The border patrol man, and I got stopped at a border patrol stop that was like on the interstate, not at the border crossing. Like, so not like when I drove into Canada, I expected to be stopped at the border, but this was actually like I'm just driving down the interstate and now I'm passing this place that's like, hey, stop. So I get flagged and I get stopped. And the man asked me, "Are you a United States citizen?" And I was just, for a fleeting second, I was just so confused. And because all of us still have moments where we have to check ourselves, right? For a fleeting second, I started to say, "I'm white. Of course I'm an American." Which, as soon as, instead I just looked at him with a really confused look because I have like Texas plates and everything else. I didn't think I looked like I had just crossed over from Mexico. But then I realized, I was like, what an absolutely ludicrous thought for me to have in a region of the nation where, to be honest, we stole land from Native Americans, or as you call them, First Nations people. We stole all this land. So what on earth does my race have to do with anything? And I would have never had that moment if I hadn't been driving. And if I hadn't been driving like right by the border, where we won't even get into the stupidity of some policies happening in the United States right now.
Mm-hmm.
But
fair enough.
I'm like, I ain't even going there. It was a really eye-opening moment for me of just like my response. The first response that went through my head, that is not, by the way, what I said out loud to him. I did check myself before I even got to that point.
Probably a good call.
Yeah, good call. He was Hispanic, so probably a really good call.
Excellent call.
I don't think he would have done anything to me if I had said it.
Sure,
but it made me aware. It made me aware that even though I live in Houston, which is one of the most diverse cities in the United States, I am technically actually a minority in Houston. I am not the majority, like numerically.
Right.
I am not a minority in our particular neighborhood, et cetera, but the city as a whole. So even then, and I like to think of myself as a really diverse, like aware person, but in that one moment, it rose to the surface.
Yeah. Well, it can always hit you when you least expect it. And, everyone comes as a bundle of lived experiences, biases, stereotypes, and also lots of good stuff where you have your own individual culture or your mix of cultures from just everything you've been through. And that's what makes up who you are. We are the sum of our experiences, and we need to always operate through that lens that we can continue to learn more and to put more into it so that we can continue to understand other people.
Right. And this is back to what I said earlier. This is why your story matters.
Mm-hmm.
Because the more all of us collectively share our stories, even when they're trivial moments that you don't think matter to other people, they do. Like, they help me learn something about you, but possibly something even bigger than that. Sharing our stories and travel. It's so funny because in a way, they're both sort of the same thing. By traveling, I create more stories, but I also touch other people's stories. Like, I get to hear them, I get to witness them, etc. I think it's the key. I think that right there, we could solve world peace.
I think you're onto something. I think you're at the point, it's true. I mean, you need to get out of your own backyard. You need to get out there and see that there are other ways of living. One big thing, a trip I keep referring to in a lot of my conversations is when I took in 2012 to Tanzania, and how much that reframed my relationship with space, my relationship with needs, and how life is a little different because of it. Now, that said, still being an active parent blogger, my children are utterly spoiled, and I'm trying to figure out how to balance that out with this worldview I have. But I'm trying to integrate a lot more giving and a lot more awareness of the world into their teaching, so that they can have enough, be armed with enough information so they can make decisions on their own when they get a little older. But I'll save that entire discourse and story for another time.
Well, and you brought it up back at the beginning of this podcast, talking about the fact that Mike and I were like, hey, let's all go sit down and break bread.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, again, that's something that we all need more of. Reach out to somebody that you don't know, meet them, actually get to know them, talk to them about, like, what's your story? Tell me about yourself, because we would all understand each other better.
Exactly. Christine, I've taken 67 and a half minutes of your time, and I thank you for that. And you do a lot of things. You are a celebrated author. You've blogged. You've spoken. Is there anything in particular you would like to point everyone to get to know you a bit better, or to understand what you're up to these days?
Well, I do also have a podcast, just like you, and on that I talk a lot about this story, how we sell, ways to market, ways to improve your business. And as you mentioned, I have a blog. Everything ultimately can be found at christinetremolay.com. I am sure that you will provide your guests with a link to that, because Tremolay is not so easy to spell.
I'll make it easy for them. Don't worry.
Any way you can reach out to me is found there. And I'm of course, on Facebook. I had managed to lose my Twitter password, so I wasn't using Twitter, but I finally got back in at last,
Yay.
2 days ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So I am back on Twitter. I'm not, Twitter killed my blog years ago because it was so much easier to send a tweet. And then eventually Facebook. So I migrated to Facebook. And if anybody's listening and they don't think that they're a blogger, but you use Facebook and you write long posts on Facebook, you're a blogger. You're just blogging. Mm-hmm. You're just using Facebook like we used to use blogs. So you can find me on Facebook as well. I'm probably most active on Facebook, and I'm also on Instagram. So I'm on the internets.
You are out there. You're putting it out there. All the stuff.
So all of the above. And as I mentioned, I love connecting with people. So don't hesitate to send me a message, to reach out to me if you want to talk more about any of these things.
Very cool. Well, I thank you very much for being on Chatting with Casey, Christine.
Thank you. It's been fun chatting with you.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to show all the social love when I get it out there so people know where to find you. And I hope everyone had a chance to learn a lot about, the impacts of travel, the impacts of stories, and why ketchup lays are so delicious.
So good.
Full circle. Full circle. All right, Christine, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's it for another Chatting with Casey, where it just goes to show you that a few bags of ketchup lays can go a long way. To New Orleans, back again, and eventually to a podcast in your ear holes. Thanks for taking the time out of your day for checking out this podcast. Thanks for Christine Tremolay for being my guest. And as always, if you like what you heard, make sure to like, rate, share, and subscribe so we can keep this thing going. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. I hope you're out there doing okay in these last days before Christmas. We have a really special Christmas Eve episode coming up next week, and we'll see you then. Guys, be well, be safe, be happy. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Including the lengths he's willing to go to for a including the lengths he's willing to go to for a Totoro contest.